He simply went out to sea, just like he had done hundreds of times before. But in the fog, he noticed something impossible: a massive iceberg with an old wooden cabin on top of it. No one believed his story until he came face to face with it. And when the door was finally opened, they found something no one expected inside. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The town sat at the very edge of the map, pressed between the cold gray sea and a line of dark, patient hills. It was a place people passed through on their way to somewhere else, a place of narrow streets that smelled of salt and diesel fuel, of peeling paint on old wooden houses, of gulls circling above rusted roofs. Winter lingered here longer than in other parts of the world, and even in summer the air carried a chill that never quite left the bones. The harbor was small, the pier older than most of the men who worked on it, and every year fewer boats returned to tie their lines to the tired wooden posts. In this town lived a fisherman who owned almost nothing. His house was small and simple, standing a little apart from the others, as if even the buildings had learned to keep their distance from him. The paint on its walls had faded to a tired color that no longer resembled anything bright. The roof leaked in 2 places when the rain was heavy, and the floorboards creaked under his boots. But it was his, and he took care of it as best he could. He lived alone, not because he preferred solitude, but because life had gradually narrowed his world until only work and routine remained. His boat was older than he liked to admit. The motor coughed and complained on cold mornings, the paint on the hull was scratched and chipped, and the nets he used were mended so many times that they were more thread than original rope. Still, the boat carried him out to sea day after day, and that was all he asked of it. The sea did not care about a man's pride or his comfort. It cared only about skill and patience, and he had learned to survive on both. Most people in town barely noticed him. Among the fishermen there was an unspoken hierarchy, and he stood somewhere near the bottom of it. The owners of larger vessels spoke loudly and confidently, while men like him kept their heads down and worked in silence. He had no crew, no expensive equipment, no powerful engine. He had only his hands, his experience, and a stubborn will that kept him going even when the catches were small and the bills were large. From his grandfather he had inherited one possession he valued more than anything else. It was an old spyglass, heavy and worn, wrapped in cracked leather that smelled faintly of oil and age. The lenses were scratched, the focus ring stiff, but it still worked better than any modern binoculars he could have afforded. His grandfather had once worked along the coast, watching the sea for signs of storms and danger, and the spyglass had been his constant companion. When the old man died, the fisherman received it as the only thing left to remember him by. Since then, it had become almost an extension of his own eyes. Every morning before heading out, he would stand on the pier and lift the spyglass to scan the horizon. He looked for flocks of birds that might reveal schools of fish, for distant lines of darker water that hinted at shifting currents, for the slow movement of ice drifting down from the far north. The sea was full of hidden messages, and a man who learned to read them lived longer than one who trusted only luck. Life here had a rhythm as steady as the tides. The alarm clock rang before dawn, long before the sun bothered to rise. He brewed strong coffee in a chipped mug, pulled on thick boots and a coat that had seen too many winters, and walked down to the harbor with his shoulders hunched against the wind. The other fishermen greeted him with brief nods or not at all. Conversation was a luxury reserved for men who had something to boast about. The work was hard and often thankless. Some days the nets came up heavy with shining silver fish, and he returned to shore tired but satisfied. Other days he burned more fuel than he earned, hauling in little more than tangled rope and disappointment. The sea did not reward effort in a fair or predictable way. It gave, and it took without explanation, and he had learned not to argue with it. Danger was always present, even on calm days. A sudden shift in weather could turn smooth water into a field of white-capped chaos. An unseen rock could tear open the belly of a careless boat. A moment of inattention could throw a man overboard into water cold enough to steal his breath in seconds. He had known men who disappeared that way, leaving only rumors and empty chairs in the harbor bar. Because of that, he trusted routine more than courage. The town itself was slowly fading. Younger people left for cities where the future promised more than damp walls and uncertain paychecks. Shops closed one by one, their windows gathering dust. Even the lighthouse on the distant cliff worked now with automated lights instead of a keeper. Only the sea remained unchanged, as indifferent and vast as it had been 100 years earlier. Despite everything, the fisherman carried a small private hope inside him. If he could save enough money, he planned to repair his boat properly, maybe replace the engine before it finally gave up for good. He dreamed of a season with decent catches, not having to worry about every storm cloud or unexpected expense. They were modest dreams, but they were his, and he guarded them carefully. Most evenings he returned home exhausted, his hands smelling of fish and salt. He cooked simple meals, listened to the radio, and fell asleep early. His life had become predictable in the way that lives often do when survival leaves little room for anything else. He did not expect adventure. In fact, he actively avoided it. Adventure was for men with stronger boats and better insurance. Yet, even in such a narrow existence, small rituals mattered. One of them was his habit of watching the sea long after others had gone inside. On foggy days especially, he would stand at the edge of the pier with the spyglass pressed to his eye, studying the shifting gray wall that separated the known world from the unknown. The fog fascinated him. It turned familiar waters into a mystery and reminded him how small a man truly was. There were times when strange things washed ashore. Broken crates with foreign labels, twisted pieces of metal, fragments of nets from distant fleets. The ocean carried secrets across impossible distances, depositing them without explanation. He had learned to accept that the sea kept stories better than any human ever could. In the weeks before everything changed, the winter had been unusually harsh. More ice than usual drifted along the coast, and the currents behaved in odd, unpredictable ways. Several fishermen complained that their usual routes no longer produced the same results. The harbor master blamed distant storms and shifting temperatures, but no one could say for sure. The fishermen noticed it too. Something about the water felt different, though he could not have explained why. Still, he followed his routine. Every morning, he scanned the horizon through his grandfather's spyglass, looking for signs of life or danger. He had done it so many times that the motion was almost unconscious. The glass showed him distant ships, wandering gulls, and the slow dance of floating ice. Most days, there was nothing more remarkable than that. Looking back later, he would realize that the signs had been there, subtle and easy to ignore. The way the fog clung longer than usual. The unusual shape of certain ice floes drifting farther south than they should have. The uneasy feeling that sometimes settled in his chest when he stared too long at the empty line where sea met sky. At the time, he brushed those thoughts aside. A man who worried about every strange detail would never leave the harbor at all. His world was small and predictable, built on habits learned over decades. He believed he understood the sea as well as any ordinary man could. He believed that nothing truly new could happen to someone like him in a town like this. The days passed one after another in comfortable sameness, and he expected them to continue that way until he was too old to work anymore. But the ocean had never promised to be predictable. It only pretended to be, lulling men into confidence before reminding them how little they actually knew. The fisherman could not have guessed that soon his quiet routine would be broken by something so strange that even the hardened men of the harbor would struggle to believe it. On an ordinary morning, much like any other, he would raise the old spyglass to his eye, peer into the familiar gray distance, and see something that did not belong in his world at all. And from that moment, the simple, unnoticed life he had always known would begin to drift away, just like the pieces of ice carried by the restless northern currents. The morning arrived like so many others before it, wrapped in cold silence and a sky that refused to decide whether it wanted to be gray or simply colorless. The fisherman woke to the familiar sound of wind pressing against the thin walls of his house, carrying with it the distant breath of the sea. Nothing about the day suggested that it would be different from any other. He dressed in the same worn clothes, drank the same bitter coffee, and walked the same narrow path down toward the harbor with his hands buried deep in his pockets. Fog lay heavy over the water, thicker than usual, swallowing the world in soft white layers. The masts of the boats at the pier appeared like thin black lines drawn on a blank page, fading at their tops into nothing. Voices from the other fishermen sounded muffled and distant, as if they came from another place entirely. The fisherman paused for a moment at the end of the dock and breathed in the damp, salty air. He had seen mornings like this hundreds of times. They were never pleasant, but they were familiar, and familiarity was a kind of comfort. He prepared his boat with slow, practiced movements, checking the motor, coiling the ropes, making sure his nets were in order. The sea was calm beneath the fog, but calm seas could change their mind without warning. Before pushing away from the pier, he reached into his coat pocket and took out the old spyglass, rubbing the lenses with a cloth as he always did. It was a small ritual, almost superstitious, but he never skipped it. His grandfather had once told him that a man who failed to look ahead would eventually run into something he could not escape. When he finally left the harbor, the town disappeared behind him almost at once. The fog closed in, turning the water into a smooth, endless surface that seemed to stretch forever in every direction. The only sounds were the steady hum of his engine and the occasional lonely cry of a gull hidden somewhere above. He steered by memory and instinct, moving toward the areas where he usually found fish, though on mornings like this even the fish seemed reluctant to be found. For a long time, nothing unusual happened. He worked in silence, dropping his nets, waiting, hauling them back in with numb fingers. The catches were small, as they often were when the weather pressed down on the sea like a heavy hand. He considered turning back early, but decided to stay out a little longer. Fuel was expensive, and every trip had to count for something. Sometime around mid-morning, as he was preparing to move to another spot, he felt that faint, uncomfortable sensation he sometimes experienced on the water, the feeling of being watched by something unseen. He shook it off at first, blaming the fog and his own imagination. Yet the unease remained, quiet but persistent, like a thought that refused to leave. Out of habit, more than necessity, he lifted the spyglass to his eye and began to scan the horizon, or at least what passed for a horizon on such a day. The glass revealed only shifting walls of mist and the faint outlines of distant waves. He turned slowly, searching in every direction, seeing nothing but the same gray emptiness. Then, just as he was about to lower the spyglass again, he noticed something. At first, it was only a difference in shade, a darker mass within the lighter fog, too large and too solid to be another boat. He adjusted the focus carefully, narrowing his eyes as the image wavered and cleared. The shape was distant but unmistakable. A massive block of ice drifted far out on the water, larger than any floe he had seen in years. That alone was not impossible, especially after such a cold winter, yet something about it felt wrong. He kept the spyglass steady and watched. The ice did not look like the usual jagged fragments that passed along the coast. Its surface appeared strangely flat in places, almost deliberate, as if it had once been part of something much larger. He followed its outline from one end to the other, trying to judge its size. It was enormous, easily larger than his boat, and perhaps larger than some of the smaller houses back in town. Then he saw it. Atop the drifting ice, slightly off-center, stood a dark shape that made no sense at all. He blinked, thinking for a moment that his eyes were playing tricks on him. The fog had a way of creating illusions, turning ordinary objects into impossible visions. He adjusted the focus again, more carefully this time, holding his breath without realizing it. The shape resolved itself into straight lines and angles, into a form that was undeniably human in its design. It was not a rock or a trick of light. It was a structure, a real building, small but unmistakable. A wooden cabin rested on the surface of the ice as naturally as if it had been placed there on purpose. For a long time the fisherman simply stared, unable to fully accept what he was seeing. Houses did not drift on ice. Buildings belonged on land, rooted to the ground, not floating through the sea like lost pieces of another world. Yet there it was, plain as day, its slanted roof and dark walls standing in silent defiance of everything he knew. He studied it carefully, afraid that if he looked away it might disappear. The cabin appeared old, weather-beaten, the kind of structure that might have stood abandoned on some remote shore for decades. One corner of the roof sagged slightly, and the walls looked uneven, as if they had been battered by countless storms. The windows were dark, some covered from the inside with what looked like faded paper or cloth. Even from a distance it carried an air of age and loneliness. The more he watched, the more questions crowded into his mind. How had such a thing ended up on an iceberg? Who could have built it there, and why? Had the ice broken away from some distant coast, carrying the cabin with it like a stolen fragment of land? The possibilities felt endless, and none of them made sense. He lowered the spyglass for a moment and rubbed his eyes, half expecting the image to be gone when he looked again. But when he raised the glass once more, the cabin remained, drifting slowly with the current, as real as the boat beneath his feet. The fisherman felt a strange mix of excitement and fear. Part of him wanted to steer closer at once, to see the impossible thing with his own eyes. Another part warned him to keep his distance. Large pieces of ice were dangerous, unpredictable. They could roll without warning, shattering anything caught too near them. Alone on the water, he could not afford to take foolish risks. Instead, he chose to observe. For nearly an hour, he followed the movement of the iceberg from afar, matching its slow progress while keeping a safe distance. Through the spyglass, he examined every detail he could make out. The cabin seemed firmly frozen to the ice, as if it had been there for years rather than days. In some places, the surrounding surface looked rough and dirty, suggesting that the ice had once been part of a larger formation that had broken apart. He noticed other small details as well. Something like a length of rope hung from one side of the cabin. A dark stain marked part of the roof. Near the base, he thought he could see objects half buried in the ice, though he could not tell what they were. Each new observation only deepened the mystery. Eventually, the fog began to shift, thinning slightly as the day grew older. The iceberg and its strange passenger drifted farther away, fading in and out of sight like a ghost unwilling to be caught. The fisherman realized with a sudden jolt that if he did not act soon, he might lose it altogether. The current could carry it anywhere, out to open sea or against some distant stretch of coast where no one would ever find it again. He turned his boat toward the harbor, his mind racing faster than the engine. This was not something he could keep to himself. Whatever that cabin was, it did not belong drifting alone in the fog. People needed to know. Authorities needed to see it. Surely they would understand the importance of such a discovery. As he approached the pier, he felt a growing sense of urgency. The town emerged slowly from the mist, ordinary and unchanged, unaware that something extraordinary was moving toward its shores. He tied up his boat with shaking hands and hurried toward the first familiar faces he saw, eager to tell them what he had witnessed. Yet, even as he began to speak, describing the massive iceberg and the cabin perched upon it, he noticed the doubtful looks, the raised eyebrows, the small skeptical smiles. The story sounded impossible, even to him as he repeated it. He could hardly blame them for not believing. If another man had come running with such a tale, he might have laughed as well. But he knew what he had seen. The image was burned into his mind with perfect clarity. Somewhere out there, hidden by drifting fog and indifferent waves, a frozen piece of the unknown was slowly making its way toward the world he understood. And from that moment on, nothing about his quiet, predictable life would ever feel ordinary again. By the time the fisherman reached the pier and began telling his story, the fog had already started to lift slightly over the town, revealing the familiar shapes of boats and buildings as if nothing unusual had ever happened. The ordinary rhythm of the harbor continued without interruption. Men unloaded crates, gulls fought over scraps, engines rattled and coughed. Against this backdrop of routine, his tale sounded more like something pulled from a dream than from real life. He spoke to the first group he found gathered near the bait shed, explaining in quick, eager words what he had seen through his grandfather's spyglass. He described the massive iceberg, the old wooden cabin standing upon it, the slow, silent way it drifted through the gray sea. As he talked, he noticed the expressions on their faces changing from mild curiosity to open doubt. One of the older fishermen shook his head before he had even finished. Another laughed softly and asked if the cold had finally gotten to him. Someone suggested that fog had a way of playing tricks on tired eyes. They had all spent enough years on the water to know how easily strange shapes could appear where nothing existed at all. A drifting buoy could look like a boat. A cluster of ice could resemble a house if a man wanted it badly enough. He tried again, more carefully this time, insisting that what he had seen was no illusion. He spoke of straight wooden walls, of windows covered from the inside, of details too precise to be imagined, yet the more he tried to convince them, the more uncertain they seemed. Stories of impossible things had a way of growing larger with every retelling, and in a town where gossip traveled faster than the tide, exaggeration was common currency. Before long, the small crowd began to thin. men drifted away, returning to their own concerns, leaving him standing alone beside his boat with his words hanging uselessly in the damp air. He felt the familiar sting of being dismissed, of having something important reduced to a joke simply because he was the one who had seen it. At the harbor office, he found no better reception. The clerk listened politely, but without real interest, tapping a pencil against the counter as if waiting for the story to end. There were no reports of unusual ice in the area, he was told. No official sightings, no warnings from larger vessels. Without photographs, coordinates, or witnesses, there was little anyone could do. The sea was full of odd sights, and most of them meant nothing at all. When he asked if someone might at least come out with him to look, the clerk offered a thin, tired smile and said that resources were limited. Boats and crews could not be sent chasing after every rumor carried in from the fog. If the iceberg truly existed and posed a danger to navigation, it would eventually be reported by someone else. Until then, it was better not to cause unnecessary alarm. The fisherman left the office feeling smaller than he had when he entered. Outside, the town went about its business as if he had never spoken a word. He realized then how little weight his voice carried in a place where men were judged by the size of their boats and the length of their paychecks. Yet doubt, once planted, began to creep into his own thoughts as well. He had been alone out there. No one else had seen what he saw. The fog had been thick, the distance great. Was it truly possible that he had mistaken some strange formation of ice for a cabin? He replayed the memory again and again, trying to catch himself in an error, but each time the image remained stubbornly clear. He remembered the angles, the shadows, the unmistakable shape of a roofline. That evening, he sat alone at the small table in his kitchen, staring at the spyglass resting beside his plate. The lenses had never lied to him before. They had shown him storms approaching, distant ships in trouble, birds leading him to good fishing grounds. Why would they betray him now? He lifted the glass and looked through it toward the dark window, as if hoping to see the answer written somewhere beyond the thin curtains. Sleep came poorly that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the drifting iceberg again, moving silently through endless gray water with its impossible burden perched on top. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that he could not simply forget what he had witnessed. Whether anyone believed him or not, the thing was real, and it was out there somewhere, drawing closer to shore with each passing hour. In the morning, he returned to the harbor earlier than usual, determined to try once more. He approached different men this time, hoping to find at least one who would listen without laughing. A few did show brief interest, but interest faded quickly when he admitted he had no proof. Without proof, a story was only a story. One man suggested he must have seen an abandoned research platform or some kind of floating debris caught in the ice. Another claimed that currents sometimes pushed large chunks of old dock structures out to sea, where they could look like buildings from a distance. Each explanation sounded reasonable on the surface, yet none matched what he remembered. As the day went on, the fisherman began to notice a new problem. The more often he told the tale, the more it seemed to change in small ways, as stories always do when passed from mouth to mouth. By afternoon, he overheard someone repeating it in the harbor bar, describing not a simple cabin but a whole house with smoke rising from the chimney. He realized with dismay that if he did not act quickly, his honest account would be swallowed by exaggeration and rumor. That realization hardened his resolve. He decided he would return to sea and find the iceberg again, this time with something to show for it. If he could photograph the cabin or record its position, no one would be able to dismiss him so easily. Proof, he understood, mattered more than conviction. He spent the rest of the day preparing. From a neighbor, he borrowed an old camera that still worked, along with several rolls of film. He packed extra fuel, fresh batteries for his flashlight, and a small notebook to write down anything important. He studied the weather reports carefully, searching for the first clear window that would allow him to venture out safely. All the while, he could feel the quiet skepticism of the town pressing against him. People greeted him with half-smiles and polite questions, humoring him the way one humors a man who has become slightly unbalanced. Even those who did not openly mock him treated the matter as a harmless obsession that would fade in time. Yet, each morning he returned to the end of the pier with his spyglass, scanning the distant water for any sign of the drifting shape. The fog continued to come and go, sometimes revealing long stretches of open sea, sometimes hiding everything beyond the first row of waves. On 2 occasions he thought he saw something far away that might have been the iceberg, but the sight vanished before he could be certain. Days passed in this uneasy pattern of watching and waiting. The fisherman began to fear that he might truly lose it forever, that the current would carry it beyond reach before he could convince anyone to help. The thought filled him with a strange mixture of relief and regret. If it disappeared, the embarrassment would end. But so would the chance to prove that he had not imagined the impossible. Late one afternoon, as he stood on the breakwater studying the horizon, a small change in the weather finally brought hope. The wind shifted, pushing the fog inland and leaving a wide corridor of clearer air along the coast. Through the spyglass he could see farther than he had in days, and there, faint but unmistakable, was the same dark mass he remembered. The iceberg had returned. It appeared closer now, larger than before, moving slowly but steadily toward the shallow waters near the bay. Even without the glass he could sense its presence, a pale, heavy shape against the brighter line of the sea. Relief washed over him so strongly that he had to sit down on a cold stone bench to steady himself. He hurried back to the harbor office, breathless with excitement, and tried once more to explain. This time his words carried a new urgency. The object was real, he insisted, and it was coming toward shore. If it grounded itself near the harbor entrance, it could become a danger to boats and navigation. Someone needed to investigate before it was too late. The response was little better than before. A supervisor promised to make a note of it and to keep an eye on the situation, but no immediate action was taken. Without independent confirmation, there was still no reason to mobilize anyone. Rules and procedures stood firmer than curiosity. Walking home through the narrow streets that evening, the fisherman understood that he could no longer rely on others. If the town would not believe him, he would have to trust himself. The sea had shown him something extraordinary, and it was up to him alone to follow where it led. As darkness settled over the rooftops and the wind carried the distant crash of waves, he made a quiet promise to himself. At the first safe opportunity, he would go back out there, find the iceberg again, and approach it as closely as he dared. He would gather the evidence that no one could ignore. Whether it brought answers or only deeper mysteries, he knew now that he could not turn away. The strange shape in the fog had chosen him as its witness, and until its secret was uncovered, his ordinary life would never feel ordinary again. The return of the iceberg changed something inside the fisherman. After days of being treated like a man chasing a mirage, he now had confirmation that he had not been mistaken. The dark shape on the horizon was real, as solid and undeniable as the cold stone beneath his feet. Seeing it again filled him with a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief because he finally had proof for himself that his eyes had not betrayed him. Anxiety because the impossible object was no longer drifting far away in distant waters. It was coming closer, moving steadily toward the very coast he knew so well. From the breakwater, he watched it for a long time, studying its slow progress with the old spyglass pressed firmly to his eye. The cabin on the ice was clearer now than it had ever been before. Even without magnification, he could make out its silhouette against the pale background. The Iceberg had entered shallower waters, carried by currents that he understood better than most men in town. Those currents would eventually bring it into the bay unless something changed. The sea around it looked different from the open water farther out. Small fragments of ice floated nearby like scattered bones, bumping gently against one another with soft, hollow sounds. The fisherman knew how dangerous such areas could be. Beneath the surface, larger pieces often lurked unseen, ready to tear the hull from any careless boat. Yet, despite the risk, he felt an almost irresistible pull toward the drifting cabin. Each day he returned to the same spot to observe. The iceberg's movement was slow but consistent, sometimes advancing a little, sometimes seeming to pause as if uncertain which direction to choose. He began to keep careful notes in the small notebook he carried in his pocket, marking the time, the weather, the direction of the wind and current. It gave him a sense of control over a situation that otherwise felt far beyond his grasp. The more he studied it, the stranger the whole thing appeared. The cabin did not look like a simple temporary shelter thrown together in desperation. Its walls were thick and carefully built, the roof reinforced with beams that suggested planning rather than haste. Whoever had constructed it had intended for it to last. But why would anyone build such a structure on ice, where nothing could ever remain stable for long? Questions multiplied with every passing hour. Had the iceberg broken away from some distant glacier, carrying the cabin with it like a stolen fragment of land? Or had the building been placed there deliberately, part of some forgotten project or expedition? The fisherman tried to imagine possible explanations, but none of them felt satisfactory. The sea was full of mysteries, yet this one seemed to stand apart from all the rest. As the days went by, the weather grew more unsettled. Winds shifted unpredictably, sometimes pushing the iceberg closer to shore, sometimes holding it back. The fisherman noticed that at certain tides it appeared to drift faster, as if caught in invisible rivers beneath the surface. He understood those hidden forces better than most, and he knew that eventually they would bring the object within reach. He also felt a growing sense of urgency. Large pieces of ice were not stable things. At any moment, the iceberg could split apart or roll over, sending the cabin tumbling into the sea. If that happened, whatever secrets it carried would be lost forever. The thought haunted him. He had already come too far to allow the mystery to vanish without at least trying to uncover it. Despite his renewed attempts, the town remained largely indifferent. A few people had finally seen the iceberg with their own eyes, but from a distance it still looked like nothing more than an odd formation of ice. Without approaching it directly, no one could be certain that a cabin truly sat upon it, and no one seemed eager to risk a boat for the sake of what might still be a strange illusion. That indifference only strengthened his determination. If others refused to act, he would act alone. The idea frightened him, but it also filled him with a quiet resolve he had not felt in years. His life had always been about small, practical struggles. This was different. This was something larger than himself, something that demanded attention whether he wanted it or not. He began to prepare seriously for the possibility of going out to the iceberg. In his small shed behind the house, he gathered what equipment he had: lengths of sturdy rope, an old climbing hook, thick gloves, a heavy coat meant for the coldest days at sea. He sharpened the small axe he carried on his boat and cleaned the blade of his utility knife. Every evening he checked and rechecked his motor, knowing that failure on the water would leave him helpless. The task ahead of him was dangerous, and he understood that clearly. Climbing onto a floating piece of ice was not something sensible men did without proper training or support. Yet he also knew the coastline in a way few others did. He understood the patterns of the waves, the places where the water grew shallow, the angles at which a boat could approach without being crushed. If anyone in town had a chance of reaching the cabin safely, it was him. Still, doubts whispered in the back of his mind. What if he reached it and found nothing at all? What if the structure turned out to be some ordinary shed torn loose from a distant shore? He imagined the laughter that would follow him home if he risked everything for nothing. But alongside those doubts was another thought, stronger and more persistent. What if he reached it and discovered something important, something that needed to be seen? One afternoon, he walked along the rocky edge of the bay, studying the water from different angles. From there, the iceberg appeared larger than ever, a pale island adrift in the gray sea. The cabin on top looked fragile and lonely, like a forgotten toy placed on an unstable table. He felt a strange connection to it, as if both of them were small, overlooked things pushed around by forces beyond their control. As he watched, a sudden shift in the current caused the iceberg to turn slightly. For the first time, he noticed what looked like scattered objects near the base of the cabin, half buried in ice and snow. They might have been nothing more than debris, yet the sight stirred his imagination. Those shapes suggested human presence, proof that the cabin was not merely an empty shell. That evening, he returned home with a firm decision made. He would not wait any longer for permission or assistance that would never come. At the first stretch of calm weather, he would take his boat out and approach the iceberg himself. He would gather whatever evidence he could and bring it back to the town that refused to listen. The following days tested his patience. Storm clouds gathered and scattered, winds rose and fell, and the sea alternated between restless agitation and deceptive calm. Through it all, the fisherman kept watch, standing at the end of the pier with his spyglass, tracking every movement of the drifting mass. It felt as if the iceberg had become a living thing in his mind, a silent traveler drawn nearer with mysterious intent. One morning, he woke to find the air unusually still. The sky was pale and clear, the sea smooth as polished stone. It was the kind of day fishermen prayed for and feared at the same time, because calm water could change without warning. He hurried to the harbor, sensing that the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived. From the pier, he saw that the iceberg had moved closer during the night, perhaps carried inward by the gentle tide. It now lay near the mouth of the bay, within a distance that made his heart beat faster. The cabin on its surface was visible even to the naked eye, dark and unmistakable against the frozen white. The fisherman stood there for a long time, weighing his options. He thought about the risks, about the cold water and shifting ice, about the fact that no one would come looking for him if something went wrong. He also thought about the years he had spent living a small, cautious life, never daring to step beyond the narrow limits others had placed around him. At last, he turned and walked back to his boat. There was no dramatic feeling of heroism, no sudden surge of confidence. There was only a quiet acceptance that some things, once seen, could not be ignored. The iceberg had come into his life uninvited, and now he felt responsible for facing it. He loaded his equipment carefully, checking each item as if preparing for a long voyage. The camera went into a waterproof bag. The ropes were coiled neatly beside the fuel can. He tied extra fenders along the side of the boat to protect it from the ice. Every movement was deliberate, controlled, a small defense against the fear growing inside him. As he pushed away from the pier, a few men watched with mild curiosity, unaware of his true intention. To them, he was simply another fisherman heading out to work. None of them guessed that he was setting off toward something far stranger than any catch of the day. The engine carried him out of the harbor and into open water, where the air grew colder and sharper. Ahead of him the iceberg waited, silent and unmoving, its burden of mystery perched upon its frozen back. With each turn of the propeller, it grew larger, more real, more impossible to deny. For the first time since he had spotted it through the fog, the fisherman felt truly alone with it. There would be no more stories, no more attempts to convince skeptical listeners. What happened next would depend entirely on his own courage and caution. As the boat drew nearer to the drifting mass, he tightened his grip on the wheel and steadied his breathing. The moment of watching from a distance was over. The moment of truth was finally at hand. The boat moved slowly through the cold water, its engine kept deliberately low as the fisherman guided it toward the drifting mass of ice. From this distance, the iceberg no longer looked like a distant curiosity, but like a solid, looming presence that seemed to grow larger with every passing minute. The cabin, perched on top of it, which had once appeared almost small through the spyglass, now revealed its true size and weight. It was a real building, not a trick of the light, not a shadow or a strange formation of snow. Seeing it this close made the fisherman feel both vindicated and uneasy at the same time. He kept the boat at a careful distance at first, circling the iceberg slowly to study it from every angle. The water around it was littered with smaller pieces of ice, some no bigger than a man's hand, others large enough to damage a hull if struck too hard. The fisherman maneuvered with caution, using the knowledge gained from years on these waters. He understood how unpredictable floating ice could be, how a single unseen current could shift an entire mass without warning. The closer he came, the more details he began to notice. The surface of the iceberg was not smooth as he had first imagined. It was rough and uneven, marked by deep cracks and ridges that suggested it had once been part of something much larger. In several places, the ice looked dirty, streaked with dark lines of frozen sediment, as if it had broken away from a coastline or a glacier that carried traces of the earth with it. The cabin itself appeared even older than he had thought. The wooden boards were weathered to a dull gray, warped and twisted by years of exposure. Some sections had clearly been repaired at different times with mismatched pieces of lumber. Nails of various sizes and ages held it together, and strips of metal had been nailed along certain joints as if someone had tried desperately to reinforce the structure against heavy storms. He killed the engine for a moment and allowed the boat to drift, listening to the strange, hollow sounds that rose from the ice. Every so often, a faint crack or groan echoed across the water as the iceberg shifted under its own immense weight. The noises reminded him that he was approaching something unstable and dangerous, not a harmless curiosity. The fisherman felt his pulse quicken as he studied the cabin through the spyglass one more time. From up close, he could see that the windows were indeed covered from the inside with faded paper or cloth, their surfaces stiff with frost. The door was closed, and along its edges thick layers of ice had formed, sealing it as if nature itself had decided to keep whatever lay inside undisturbed. He guided the boat nearer again, choosing his path carefully between the floating fragments. At one point, a larger piece of ice bumped gently against the side of the hull, sending a dull shiver through the metal. The sound made him flinch, reminding him how easily the situation could turn from manageable to deadly. The fisherman circled the iceberg twice before deciding where to make his approach. One side sloped more gently than the others, forming a kind of natural ramp that looked safer than the steep, jagged edges elsewhere. Even so, climbing onto it would be no simple task. The ice was slick and treacherous, and a single misstep could send him sliding into water cold enough to steal his life in minutes. He secured the boat as best he could, tying it off to a protruding chunk of ice with a heavy rope. The knot had to be perfect. If the iceberg shifted or turned, the line could snap or drag the boat into a position where it would be crushed. The fisherman checked it twice, pulling hard to test its strength before trusting his weight to it. Standing on the deck, he hesitated for a long moment. The rational part of his mind reminded him that no one had asked him to do this. He was not a trained rescuer or an explorer. He was simply a man with an old boat and a stubborn sense of responsibility. Yet, something inside him would not allow him to turn back now. The mystery had drawn him this far, and he needed to see it through to the end. With a deep breath, he stepped from the boat onto the lower edge of the iceberg. The surface was even colder than he expected, the ice hard and unyielding beneath his boots. He crouched low, testing each movement carefully, listening for the faintest sign of cracking. The entire mass felt alive beneath him, shifting slightly with the motion of the sea. Progress was slow and exhausting. He used the small climbing hook he had brought to steady himself, driving it into the ice wherever he could find a secure hold. In some places, he had to crawl rather than walk, spreading his weight to avoid slipping. The wind cut through his coat like a blade, and within minutes his hands felt stiff and clumsy inside his gloves. As he drew near to the cabin, the scale of it became clearer. It was larger than a simple shed, perhaps big enough for several people to live inside. The roof slanted at an angle that suggested careful planning, and a short metal pipe protruded from one side like the remains of a chimney. The sight of that small detail sent a strange chill through him. Someone had once tried to make this place warm. Reaching the base of the structure took far longer than he expected. What had looked like a short distance from the boat turned into nearly an hour of cautious, nerve-wracking movement. By the time he finally stood beside the frozen walls, he was breathing hard, his legs trembling with fatigue. Up close, the cabin felt even more real, more solid, more human. He could see the grain of the wood, the rust on old nails, the crude repairs that spoke of long, difficult seasons. Near one corner, he noticed the remains of a rope, half buried in ice, frayed and stiff with age. It looked as if it had once been tied to something that no longer existed. The door drew his attention immediately. A thick crust of ice had formed all around its frame, locking it in place. It was impossible to tell when it had last been opened, but judging by the buildup, it had been many years. He pressed his gloved hand against the surface and felt nothing but hard, unforgiving cold. The fisherman tried to peer through one of the windows, scraping away a thin layer of frost with his knife. Beneath it, he found only darkness. Whatever lay inside was hidden completely, sealed away like a secret no one was meant to discover. He walked slowly around the cabin, examining every side. In several places, he found more small objects trapped in the surrounding ice: a bent metal bracket, a scrap of fabric, something that looked like part of an old tool. Each discovery convinced him further that this was not an empty structure, but a place where real people had once lived and worked. For a moment, he considered trying to force the door open then and there. He had brought tools, and with enough effort he might have broken through the frozen seal, but the thought of doing so alone, without anyone else knowing where he was or what he had found, stopped him. If something waited inside that required careful handling, he had no right to disturb it recklessly. Instead, he focused on gathering evidence. He took out the camera and began photographing everything he could: the cabin from every angle, the door sealed in ice, the scattered objects frozen around it, the massive iceberg itself. He wrote detailed notes in his small notebook recording what he saw and the exact position of the ice relative to the coastline. The work calmed him, giving purpose to his fear. With each photograph, he felt more certain that no one would be able to dismiss his discovery again. These were not the shaky words of a tired fisherman, but solid proof captured on film. While circling the cabin a second time, he noticed something that made him pause. Near the door, partly hidden by snow and frost, was a small metallic object embedded in the ice. He knelt carefully and brushed it clean with his glove. It appeared to be a buckle or clasp of some kind, old and tarnished, the sort of thing that might have belonged to a belt or a piece of equipment. The sight of it stirred his imagination in uncomfortable ways. Objects like that did not simply appear on ice by accident. They suggested human presence, perhaps even human struggle. The fisherman felt a growing sense that he was standing not just on a curiosity of nature, but on the edge of a forgotten story. At last, he stepped back and looked at the cabin as a whole. The wind whistled softly around it, carrying with it the distant cries of seabirds. There was something deeply lonely about the place, something that made him feel like an intruder into a chapter of history long closed. He knew then that he could not handle this alone. Whatever secrets lay beyond that frozen door were too important and too uncertain for one man to face without help. He had done what he set out to do. He had found it, touched it, proven that it existed. Now it was time to bring others into the truth. The return journey to the boat felt even more dangerous than the approach. The ice seemed slicker, the cracks more numerous, as if the iceberg resented his presence and wished to be left in peace. When he finally climbed back onto the deck and untied the rope, he felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly made him dizzy. As he started the engine and pulled away, he turned for one last look. The cabin stood exactly as before, silent and unmoving, guarding its mysteries beneath layers of ancient frost. By the time the fisherman reached open water again, he had already made his decision. He would not allow the town to ignore him any longer. With photographs, notes, and his own first-hand experience, he would go to the authorities and demand that they take action. Something important waited inside that drifting structure. He could feel it with a certainty deeper than logic. And, whatever it was, the world needed to see it before the restless sea decided to claim it forever. The return to shore felt very different from every other return the fisherman had ever made. As his boat crossed the familiar waters of the bay, he no longer felt like an ordinary man finishing an ordinary day of work. The weight of what he had seen pressed on him with every turn of the propeller. The photographs in his pocket, the notes in his small notebook, the memory of the frozen cabin standing silently on the ice, all of it convinced him that he had crossed some invisible line from routine life into something far more serious. When he reached the pier, he wasted no time. Without stopping to speak to anyone, he went directly to the harbor office, his boots leaving wet marks on the wooden floor as he stepped inside. The same clerk who had dismissed him before looked up in mild surprise. This time, the fisherman did not tell a story. He placed the camera on the counter, opened his notebook, and began to show proof instead of words. The photographs changed everything. Even in their simple, unpolished form, they clearly showed the iceberg, the cabin, the sealed door, and the scattered objects frozen into the surrounding ice. The clerk's expression shifted from polite boredom to cautious concern. Within minutes, a supervisor was called, and then another man, and soon the small office was filled with serious faces studying the images one by one. Questions followed, precise and professional. How close had he come? Was the structure stable? Had he entered it? What were the exact coordinates? The fisherman answered as carefully as he could, explaining every detail of his approach and his observations. For the first time since the entire ordeal began, people were truly listening to him. By late afternoon, a decision was finally made. The situation was too unusual and potentially dangerous to ignore any longer. If the iceberg grounded itself near the harbor entrance, it could threaten navigation. More importantly, the possibility that human remains or valuable historical artifacts might be inside the cabin required official intervention. A small team would be assembled the next morning to investigate properly. That night, the fisherman slept better than he had in days, though his dreams were filled with images of ice and dark windows. He felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. He had done his part, yet he knew that the hardest moments were still ahead. Whatever waited inside that structure would soon be revealed, and he could not shake the feeling that it would not be something simple. The following day dawned cold but clear. A thin layer of frost covered the roofs of the town, and the sea lay unusually calm beneath a pale blue sky. At the pier, a small group had already gathered, members of the local Coast Guard, a police officer, and 2 men from a regional emergency response unit. Their boat was larger and better equipped than his own, fitted with safety lines, climbing gear, and medical supplies. The fisherman joined them quietly, carrying his notebook and the old spyglass that had started everything. He was not officially part of the team, yet everyone understood that without him they would never have found the iceberg at all. For the first time, he felt something close to respect in the way they spoke to him. The journey out to the ice took less time than he expected. With the weather clear, the massive white shape was visible from far away, floating patiently in the same place he had left it. As they approached, the professionals began to prepare their equipment, checking ropes and harnesses, discussing the safest angle for climbing onto the surface. Even with experienced men present, the approach was tense. The iceberg seemed larger now, more imposing, and the sounds it made were louder than the day before. Low groans echoed from deep within its frozen body, and small cracks appeared and disappeared along its edges. The Coast Guard captain decided that only 2 men would climb up at first, while the others remained on the boat to monitor the situation. The fishermen watched as they secured lines and carefully made their way across the treacherous surface. Seeing trained professionals struggle with the same dangers he had faced alone filled him with a quiet pride. He had not been reckless or foolish. He had simply done what needed to be done. When they finally reached the cabin, the real work began. The men examined the exterior with the same cautious curiosity the fisherman had felt. They confirmed his observations. The structure was old, firmly frozen to the ice, and sealed so completely that it might not have been opened in decades. After a brief discussion over the radio, permission was given to attempt entry. The process of breaking the icy seal around the door took far longer than anyone expected. Using heavy tools, the team chipped away at the thick crust that had formed along the frame. Each strike echoed sharply in the cold air. The ice resisted stubbornly, as if determined to protect whatever lay beyond. At last, a narrow gap appeared, then widened slowly as more frozen layers were removed. The door creaked but did not open. Something on the inside seemed to be holding it in place. With careful effort and the help of a pry bar, the men forced it free, and the entrance to the cabin was finally revealed. A breath of air drifted out from within, dry and impossibly cold, carrying with it a faint smell of old wood and something else, something harder to identify. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the professionals seemed reluctant to cross that threshold, as if aware that they were about to disturb a place that had been untouched for a very long time. The captain gave a short command, and one of the responders stepped inside with a powerful flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the interior little by little. What it showed made everyone fall silent. The cabin was not empty. Far from it. Against the far wall stood a small table, its surface covered with frost but still holding a collection of objects. Metal cups, a battered lantern, a stack of papers weighed down by a stone. Along one side were narrow bunks built directly into the walls, their blankets stiff and white with ice. On shelves above them rested boxes, tools, and equipment that looked older than anything the fisherman had ever seen. The scene had the strange feeling of a room frozen in the middle of an ordinary day. Nothing appeared to have been thrown about in panic. Everything was in its place, as if the people who had once lived there had simply stepped outside and never returned. Then the flashlight moved to the corner. What it illuminated there made the captain immediately reach for his radio. His voice, calm but urgent, requested additional support and medical personnel at once. The fisherman, standing outside and watching through the open doorway, felt his stomach tighten with dread. In that corner lay the undeniable evidence that this was not merely an abandoned shelter. There were shapes beneath the layers of frost that could only be human. The remains of at least 3 people rested there, preserved by the endless cold, their forms wrapped in heavy clothing and sleeping bags. Time had not erased them. It had only frozen them in place. A deep silence fell over the group. Even the sea seemed to grow quieter. The men inside moved with new care, treating the space not as a curiosity but as a site of tragedy. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, every step documented with professional precision. Further inspection revealed more clues. On the table lay several leather-bound journals, their pages brittle but still legible beneath the ice. Near them rested an old camera sealed inside a metal case, protected from the worst of the elements. Maps hung on one wall, marked with lines and coordinates written in a careful hand. It became clear very quickly that this was not the cabin of a random traveler or fisherman. The equipment, the records, and the careful organization all pointed towards something far more significant. One of the responders carefully opened a small metal box and discovered identification tags, documents bearing names and dates from decades earlier. As the items were examined, a picture began to form. The dates matched the time of a well-known expedition that had vanished many years ago under mysterious circumstances. The names on the tags matched those of explorers whose fate had never been determined. What had once been a legend spoken of in old newspaper articles was suddenly standing before them in frozen, heartbreaking reality. The realization spread through the team like a shockwave. They were not simply investigating an odd structure on an iceberg. They had found the final refuge of people who had disappeared into history. People whose families had spent years wondering what had become of them. The fisherman stood at the threshold, watching the careful work unfold, feeling both proud and deeply saddened. His discovery had led to something important, yet it was not a joyful thing. The cabin was not a treasure chest or a forgotten fortune. It was a tomb carried across the sea by indifferent ice. As more artifacts were gently uncovered, the story of the lost expedition slowly emerged. The journals contained detailed entries describing a journey gone terribly wrong, of a balloon flight forced down onto unstable ice, of desperate efforts to survive in conditions harsher than anyone had anticipated. The camera, when carefully removed from its case, promised even more answers once its film could be developed. Hours passed as the team worked, documenting everything before making any attempt to remove items from the site. The iceberg itself groaned and shifted beneath them, reminding everyone that their time was limited. Eventually, the decision was made to secure the cabin and return later with additional experts and equipment. When they finally left the frozen shelter and made their way back to the boat, the mood was solemn. No one spoke much on the journey back to shore. Each man carried the weight of what he had seen in his own way. For the fisherman, the day marked the end of doubt and the beginning of understanding. The impossible object he had spotted through the fog was no longer a mystery of his imagination. It was a doorway into the past, opened because he had chosen to look when others looked away. As the town came into view and the harbor drew closer, he knew that the story was only beginning. What lay hidden inside that drifting cabin would soon be shared with the world, and nothing about his quiet life would ever be quite the same again. The return from the iceberg marked the beginning of a very different kind of activity in the small town. What had started as a single fisherman's strange observation had suddenly grown into something official, something serious, something that required attention far beyond the limits of the harbor. By the time the boat carrying the team reached the pier, the first calls had already been made to regional authorities. Within hours, the quiet rhythm of the place was interrupted by unfamiliar vehicles, new faces, and the unmistakable presence of organized investigation. The cabin on the drifting ice was no longer just an oddity. It had become a protected site. Access to the area was restricted, and plans were made to secure the iceberg as safely as possible, while specialists could be brought in. The Coast Guard established a temporary perimeter, warning other vessels to keep their distance. What had once been ignored and doubted was now treated with careful urgency. For the fisherman, the change was almost overwhelming. Only days earlier, he had stood alone at the end of the pier, trying to convince people that he was not imagining things. Now, he watched as men in uniforms and experts with serious expressions discussed his discovery in technical terms he barely understood. The cabin he had first seen through a foggy lens was suddenly a matter of official reports, protocols, and legal procedures. Investigators arrived from the nearest large city the following morning. Among them were historians, forensic specialists, and representatives of a national research institute. They treated the situation with the gravity reserved for rare and significant finds. Every photograph, every note, every observation made by the fisherman was carefully reviewed and recorded. His small notebook, once filled only with personal reminders and weather details, became part of an official file. The first task was to identify the people whose remains had been found inside the frozen shelter. Using the documents recovered from the cabin, the team began to compare names and dates with historical records. It did not take long before the connection became clear. The materials matched the details of a famous expedition that had vanished more than 30 years earlier, an event that had once captured headlines and then slowly faded into unanswered legend. Old newspaper archives were brought out and examined. Stories were pieced together from fragments of memory and dusty files. The expedition, it turned out, had been an ambitious attempt to explore a remote polar region using a high-altitude balloon. The plan had been bold for its time, relying on new technology and daring navigation. When contact was lost and the crew never returned, search efforts had been launched, but after months of fruitless attempts, the mission had been declared a tragic mystery. Now, unexpectedly, that mystery had reappeared on a piece of drifting ice off a quiet coastline. The journals found inside the cabin became the heart of the investigation. They were handled with extreme care, slowly thawed and preserved so that the fragile pages would not crumble. As experts began to read the entries, a detailed picture of the final days of the expedition emerged. The neat handwriting told a story of excitement, confidence, and careful preparation at the beginning, followed by increasing tension and fear as things went wrong. According to the records, the balloon had encountered a violent storm shortly after takeoff, forcing the crew to make an emergency descent onto unstable ice far from their intended route. Supplies had been limited, and the men had done everything they could to survive while waiting for rescue that never came. The cabin, it seemed, had been built from materials they carried with them, reinforced with anything they could salvage. It had been their last shelter against a world of endless cold. The camera found on the table promised to add even more to the story. Specialists carefully transported it to a laboratory, where the old film was extracted with almost surgical precision. When the images were finally developed, they revealed scenes that sent a wave of emotion through everyone involved. There were photographs of the balloon before the flight, of the crew smiling proudly beside their equipment, of early days on the ice when hope was still alive. Later, images showed a harsher reality. The balloon lying damaged on the frozen ground. Men bundled in heavy coats, their faces thin and tired. Attempts to mark their location, to signal passing aircraft that never appeared. The last photographs were the most difficult to look at. Empty landscapes, a crude shelter rising against the horizon, and finally the interior of the very cabin where the camera had been found, captured as if the photographer had known these might be the last records they would ever leave behind. Each new piece of evidence added weight to the unfolding narrative. The maps discovered on the wall were compared with modern charts, allowing experts to trace the path the men had taken after the crash. It became clear that they had tried repeatedly to reach safety, only to be driven back by impossible conditions. The iceberg itself was now understood to be part of a larger ice shelf that had broken away years later, carrying the cabin out to sea like a silent message in a bottle. For the first time in decades, families of the missing explorers received news that their long wait for answers was finally over. Phone calls were made, letters sent, and arrangements discussed. What had once been a source of endless uncertainty was now becoming a story with a beginning, a middle, and at last an ending. As the investigation continued, the fisherman found himself called upon again and again. His knowledge of local currents helped experts understand how the iceberg might have traveled such a long distance. His detailed observations provided valuable context for their technical analysis. He was no longer treated as an outsider, but as an essential witness, a man whose simple attentiveness had made the entire discovery possible. Yet, even as the official story took shape, there were hints of deeper layers still waiting to be uncovered. Among the recovered documents were references to additional objectives of the expedition, notes that suggested scientific experiments and measurements whose purpose was not immediately clear. Some pages contained coordinates and coded remarks that puzzled even the most experienced researchers. These details sparked quiet speculation. Had the mission been more than a simple exploration? Were there aspects of it that had never been made public? The possibility added an air of intrigue to an already remarkable case. Certain officials began to take a particular interest, requesting copies of specific materials and asking questions that went beyond historical curiosity. The fisherman noticed these undercurrents, but did not fully understand them. He sensed only that the discovery he had stumbled upon might hold more significance than anyone initially realized. The cabin on the Iceberg was not merely a relic of personal tragedy. It might also be a fragment of a larger story that reached into politics and science and forgotten ambitions. Despite the growing complexity, the central truth remained clear. The frozen shelter had preserved the final chapter of human lives that deserved to be remembered with dignity. Plans were made to recover the remains respectfully and to bring them home for proper burial. A memorial service was discussed, and historians began preparing reports that would finally close a case left open for far too long. The town itself changed under the weight of attention. Reporters arrived asking questions and filming the harbor where everything had begun. People who had once laughed at the fisherman's tale now repeated it proudly to visitors, as if they had believed him from the start. The small community found itself briefly at the center of national interest, its ordinary streets filled with unfamiliar voices. Through it all, the fisherman moved quietly on the edges, watching events unfold with a mixture of pride and humility. He had never sought recognition, yet he could not deny a certain satisfaction in knowing that his persistence had mattered. Without his decision to look closely, to trust his own eyes, the drifting cabin might have passed unnoticed into the open ocean, taken its secrets with it forever. As the weeks passed and more information came to light, the full emotional impact of the discovery settled over everyone involved. Reading the final journal entries, seeing the last photographs, it was impossible not to imagine the courage and despair of the men who had lived out their final days in that small wooden shelter. The Iceberg had preserved not only their bodies, but their voices, their hopes, and their struggle to survive. In quiet moments, the fisherman thought often about those unknown explorers. He wondered what they would have felt if they could have known that, decades later, a simple man with an old spyglass would finally bring them home. The thought humbled him and filled him with a deep, sober gratitude. The investigation was far from over, but its direction was now clear. The mystery that had once seemed impossible was being carefully untangled, thread by thread. Every recovered object, every decoded note, every developed photograph contributed to a story that was at last being told in full. And at the center of it all stood the fisherman, an ordinary man who had noticed something extraordinary and refused to look away. As he watched the professionals continue their work, he understood that the drifting iceberg had carried more than a forgotten cabin. It had carried a piece of history back into the world, waiting patiently for someone brave enough to see it. The final answers would take time, and new questions would certainly arise. But one thing was no longer in doubt. The lost expedition had been found, its silence broken at last by the slow, steady efforts of those determined to uncover the truth. For the fisherman, that knowledge alone was enough. Yet, deep inside, he sensed that the story might not be entirely finished, that somewhere beyond the pages of journals and the frames of old photographs, Another chapter still waited to be discovered. By the time the first official report was released, the small coastal town no longer resembled the quiet place it had been only a few weeks earlier. News of the drift in Iceberg and the frozen cabin had spread far beyond the local harbor. Journalists arrived with cameras and microphones, satellite trucks parked near the pier, and strangers walked the streets asking questions about a fisherman who had once been almost invisible. The story had captured the public imagination in a way no one could have predicted. Television programs spoke of the discovery as one of the most remarkable historical finds in decades. Newspapers printed long articles about the lost expedition, about the recovered journals and photographs, about the extraordinary chain of events that had led a simple man with an old spyglass to uncover a mystery older than many of the town's buildings. The harbor, once a place of routine labor and quiet conversations, turned into a backdrop for interviews and reports broadcast across the country. For the fisherman, the sudden attention felt both flattering and uncomfortable. He was not accustomed to being noticed. For most of his life, he had moved through the world without leaving much trace, working hard and keeping to himself. Now, people stopped him on the street, shook his hand, asked for his story, wanted to take pictures with him as if he were some kind of hero. He accepted their gratitude politely, but deep inside he remained the same cautious man he had always been. The town itself changed almost overnight. Visitors arrived hoping to see the place where history had resurfaced from the sea. The small cafe near the pier filled with new faces. Local officials spoke proudly about the role their community had played in solving an international mystery. Those who had once doubted the fisherman now repeated his tale as if they had believed it from the beginning. Memory, he realized, could be surprisingly flexible. Amid the excitement, the formal process of honoring the lost explorers began. Arrangements were made to transport their remains with dignity to their home countries. Memorial services were planned, and families who had lived for decades with unanswered questions finally received the closure they had thought impossible. Letters of thanks arrived at the harbor office, some addressed directly to the fisherman whose persistence had brought the truth to light. He read those letters slowly, often more than once. They affected him more deeply than any newspaper headline or television interview. Knowing that his actions had helped real people find peace gave meaning to everything he had endured. The doubts, the cold hours on the water, the dangerous climb onto the ice. It reminded him that behind every great story there were human lives, fragile and precious. Not everything about the aftermath was simple or pleasant. As the investigation continued, certain organizations began to show interest in the more mysterious aspects of the expedition. Scholars debated the purpose of some of the recovered equipment, and officials quietly reviewed documents that suggested the mission might have involved experiments never fully explained. The fisherman heard rumors of classified reports and meetings held behind closed doors. Occasionally, strangers approached him with unusual offers. Some wanted to buy exclusive rights to his photographs. Others suggested he should write a book or allow his life to be turned into a film. A few hinted at financial deals connected to the unpublished materials found in the cabin. He listened politely, but declined most of these proposals. The story, he felt, did not belong to him alone, and he had no desire to profit from the suffering of men who had already paid such a heavy price. The authorities formally recognized his contribution in a modest ceremony held at the town hall. He received a small plaque thanking him for his vigilance and courage, along with a letter signed by several high-ranking officials. The applause embarrassed him, yet it also warmed something inside that had long been cold. For once, the world acknowledged that even an ordinary man could do something important. In quieter moments, however, he struggled with complicated emotions. He often thought about the explorers whose final days had unfolded inside that small wooden shelter. He imagined their hopes as they built it, their determination as they waited for rescue that never came. Knowing that he had been the one to discover them filled him with pride, but also with a heavy sense of responsibility. The iceberg itself eventually broke apart in a storm and melted back into the sea, leaving no trace of the structure it had carried for so long. Only the carefully preserved artifacts remained, now stored safely in museums and archives. The world moved on, as it always does, to new stories and new headlines. Yet, for the fisherman, the memory of that silent white mass and the cabin on its back would never fade. Life in the town slowly returned to something resembling normal. The reporters left, the visitors dwindled, and the harbor once again filled mostly with familiar faces. The fisherman went back to his daily work, rising before dawn, mending nets, guiding his aging boat out into the cold water. On the surface, everything appeared the same as before. But he was not the same man. He noticed small changes within himself. He walked with a little more confidence. He spoke more easily to others, no longer feeling quite so invisible. People greeted him with genuine respect, and even those who had once dismissed him now treated him as someone worth listening to. The simple recognition made his hard life feel lighter. One of the local maritime schools invited him to speak to students about the importance of careful observation at sea. Standing in front of a classroom, he told them how a single glance through an old spyglass had changed everything. He encouraged them to trust their instincts, to pay attention to details others might overlook. The experience surprised him. He discovered that he enjoyed passing on what he had learned. Still, he never allowed the attention to turn him into something he was not. He refused to pretend that he had acted out of heroism or ambition. Whenever people praised him too loudly, he reminded them gently that he had only done what any responsible person should have done. The sea had shown him something unusual, and he had chosen not to ignore it. That was all. In the months that followed, historians published detailed accounts of the expedition, using the recovered materials to reconstruct every stage of the doomed journey. Documentaries were produced, and the names of the lost explorers were spoken again with respect and admiration. The fisherman watched some of these programs with quiet satisfaction, recognizing familiar photographs and objects on the screen. Occasionally, new information emerged from the ongoing research. Experts continued to debate the more puzzling elements of the mission, and certain aspects remained unclear. The fisherman sensed that some secrets might never be fully explained. He accepted that easily. The sea, he knew, rarely surrendered all of its mysteries. One afternoon, long after the excitement had faded, he stood once more at the end of the pier with his grandfather's spyglass in hand. The horizon stretched before him as it always had, vast and unknowable. He raised the glass to his eye out of habit and scanned the distant water. Everything looked calm and ordinary. No drifting ice, no impossible cabins, no signs of another forgotten story waiting to be found. Yet, he felt different as he looked out across the waves. He understood now that the world was far larger and stranger than he had ever imagined. Extraordinary things could appear without warning in the most ordinary of lives. All it took was a willingness to see them. The plaque he had received hung modestly on the wall of his small house, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It reminded him that even someone with little power or influence could make a difference simply by paying attention and acting with honesty. That knowledge gave him a quiet sense of peace. Sometimes, when the fog rolled in thick and heavy as it had on the morning everything began, he felt a familiar stirring of curiosity. He would smile to himself and lift the spyglass once more, just in case. Not because he hoped for another adventure, but because he now understood that the sea always held more stories than anyone could count. The town returned to its slow, steady rhythm, and the fisherman returned to his simple routines. Yet, beneath the surface of that ordinary life lay a profound change. He no longer saw himself as an insignificant man at the edge of the world. He saw himself as someone capable of noticing, of caring, of acting when it mattered. And that, more than any headline or ceremony, was the true consequence of the discovery. On calm evenings, he would sit by the window, listening to the distant sounds of gulls and waves, thinking about the long chain of chance that had brought the iceberg to his shore. He understood how easily he might have ignored it, how close the story had come to being lost forever. The thought filled him with a deep and lasting gratitude. The world eventually forgot his name, as the world forgets most names. New events took center stage, and the drifting cabin became another chapter in history books rather than a daily topic of conversation. But for the fisherman, the experience remained alive, woven into the fabric of who he had become. He continued to go out on the water, to battle storms and bad catches, to live the hard, honest life he had always known. Yet he carried within him a quiet certainty that his life had mattered in a way he had never expected. The sea had chosen him for reasons he would never understand, to be the one who looked closely when others looked away, and whenever he raised the old spyglass to his eye, he felt connected not only to his grandfather who had once used it, but also to the explorers whose story he had helped bring home. In that connection, he found a sense of purpose that no amount of fame or money could ever replace. The drifting iceberg was gone, the cabin dismantled and preserved in museums, the investigation largely complete. But the lesson remained, simple and enduring. In a vast and unpredictable world, even the smallest act of attention could change everything. The fisherman knew this now with absolute certainty, and as he stood once more on the familiar pier, watching the endless horizon, he understood that his ordinary life would never again feel quite so ordinary. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Hit the like button to help this video reach more people, and share it with someone who loves real mysteries. Write in the comments which city or country you're watching from today. Stay tuned for more stories.